This is Unit 2, Balancing Counterterrorism Strategies. Now, throughout this course, we're going to be evaluating the benefits of viewing terrorism from a criminal justice perspective, as opposed to that of, say, military, diplomatic, or the intelligence community. The authors of this chapter, Brian Villa and Joanne Savage, present what they call an evolutionary ecological model to counterterrorism that views terrorism as a crime and counterterrorism in terms of crime prevention. Although terrorism is generally viewed as being a unique category of crime, it's not really necessary to view it that way. In fact, it can be actually counterproductive because it encourages an overly aggressive, proactive approach to combating it, and it limits other viable options that might be available. An understanding of the underlying motivations behind terrorist behavior is essential to advancing effective strategies. The most effective strategies over the long run will be those that balance opportunity reduction, deterrence, and developmental interventions. Now, defining anti-terrorism strategies as a war on terror can be hurtful because war is a violent act against a government or a people, but terror is only a tactic. You don't fight a war against tactics. You develop counter-tactics. Viewing counterterrorism as a war on tactics limits the introduction of otherwise effective counter-strategies such as those offered by the evolutionary ecological model. Now, the evolutionary ecological model looks at the motivation and development of terrorists from a natural progression, not unlike Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Individuals develop strategies to meet physical, emotional, and spiritual needs and to compete for limited resources. Criminals develop their motivations and mindsets from this process, and so do terrorists. Think about it this way. In order for a crime to occur, there must be a sufficiently motivated individual who has developed an effective crime-committing strategy, a suitable target, and an absence of an effective guardian. The same is true of terrorists. Much of our traditional counterterrorism strategies has focused on opportunity reduction by hardening targets and providing additional guardians, instead of dealing with the developmental strategies aimed at some of the underlying motivations. In the parlance of drug enforcement, we might call it demand reduction. According to the authors, there are three common characteristics of terrorists. One, they are the member of a group or a cause that they perceive as being threatened. Two, they have internalized justifications for extreme violence to protect the interests of that group. And three, they have strong cultural or religious beliefs that value self-sacrifice and martyrdom. Extreme behaviors such as suicide bombings or the killings of innocents can be justified under extreme belief systems. True believers think rationally. They just do so within the confines of an irrational belief system. In regards to radical Islamist terrorists, part of that system is to believe in future rewards for suffering martyrdom within the context of a jihad. As opposed to more traditional street criminals like robbers, burglars, or violent offenders, terrorists tend to be motivated by rather altruistic and unselfish motives where they put the interest of their group ahead of their own. Terrorism is most frequently employed by groups that view themselves as being disenfranchised and do not have access to the necessary weaponry for a fair fight. This is why terrorism is often referred to as asymmetric warfare. Now, don't underestimate the important role that the Israeli-Palestinian conflict plays in the motivation of Islamic terrorists throughout the globe. The perceived threat that Israel presents to the Palestinian way of life and to its statehood is a key motivator for the most extreme acts of terror against what they call the enemies of God. As students at a Christian university, this should be of particular relevance and interest to you. We will be examining this Israeli-Palestinian conflict in much greater detail in the near future. But in the meantime, watch closely what is going on there now and take the time to educate yourself on some of the things that have happened in the past so you have a proper context of understanding this all-important conflict. The authors get into the routine activities theories, also known as opportunity theory in the crime prevention realm, and it requires a motivated offender, a suitable target, and the absence of a reliable or capable guardian. The evolutionary ecological model that we're examining here within this unit holds that there must be a balance to counter crime strategies in order for them to be successful. Opportunity reduction, deterrence, and developmental strategies must all three be brought into play. For example, protective strategies aimed at opportunity reduction cannot be effective alone because of the wide array of potential targets available to the terrorists. Coupled with their ability to develop counter strategies to every counter strategy, neutralizing terrorists does very little unless the recruitment efforts are also targeted, and waging war, especially overseas, is far too costly for even the most wealthy nation to maintain for the long term, compared, let's say, to the cost of maintaining an asymmetric posture on the part of the terrorists. Likewise, deterrence alone is insufficient, largely because of the asymmetries between what industrialized societies have to lose versus what the terrorists have to lose. The threat of retaliation must evoke sufficient fear to be effective. Plus, as the old adage goes, for punishment to be effective, it must be both swift and it must be sure. Unfortunately, in the case of our current approach to counterterrorism, it's neither. Much like the threat of the death penalty is not an effective deterrent within our system of capital punishment. Now, for the record, I favor the death penalty because of justice and the value it places on human life, but not for its deterrent effect. Now, because of the limitations on opportunity reduction and deterrent strategies, developmental strategies that attack the root causes of terrorism are so important. War is not particularly effective against an enemy who is motivated by deeply held religious beliefs that promise spiritual rewards for acts of heroism or self-sacrifice, or who view themselves as disenfranchised and powerless against stronger military and economic powers. In fact, an over-reliance on aggressive, proactive strategies of opportunity reduction and deterrence tends to rapidly increase terrorist recruitment efforts and fuel motivation for active, violent resistance. So in this way, without the balance of developmental strategies aimed at impacting the root causes of terrorism, which is in fact its belief system, our counterterrorism posture can actually cause rather than constrain terrorism. Developmental strategies can target the individual by undermining the fundamental belief system that they are part of a disadvantaged group, that their group is threatened, that they are socially isolated, and that violence is the only means of redress available to them. It is possible to chip away at the underlying belief system that breeds terrorism. This course of action is based on the power of building trust-based relationships, and it overcomes the ability of the terrorists and their leaders to demonize or to dehumanize members of other groups. It's the coactive or community policing approach to anti-terrorism. Once the relationship is established, then the belief systems that justify violence can be addressed. It's much more difficult to demonize someone that you know, or to demonize someone who is like someone that you know. One such strategy, developmental strategy, can be found in humanitarian efforts that are designed to improve infrastructure and address quality of life issues. Now, the caution here, and we do this on a large scale incidentally, the caution here is that it can result in empire building, which arguably is what has occurred in Iraq and Afghanistan, as well as developing an entitlement mentality on part of the people that you're there trying to help. I saw that in Afghanistan as well. Now, the U.S. military has adopted a developmental strategy, developmental doctrine of its own with their counterinsurgency strategies, also known as COIN, C-O-I-N. It, in theory at least, focuses on winning the hearts and minds of the indigenous peoples and co-opting them into fighting against the insurgents. However, as I often said in many discussions at the embassy when we were there trying to shape foreign policy and our national defense posture there, particularly as it dealt with the professionalization of the police and the reform of the criminal justice sector, there's two sides to this coin. One side is the hard skills, the tactics, the competencies needed to defeat the enemy. The other is the soft skills, the ones focused on building relationships. The foundations of this side of the coin will be found in the principles of good character, the building blocks of integrity and strong relationships. This is the coactive approach to counterterrorism that we will be examining in much greater detail in the coming units of instruction.